Hello students, I'd like to go over how to set up your painting area. First of all, make sure that you're painting on a surface that isn't damaged by water, so a kitchen counter or a glass table is fine, but I wouldn't work on a wooden table because that could damage it. If nothing else, you can get a piece of cardboard and work on that, or you can sit on the floor, that's fine too. Okay, so setting up your area, you want to have your watercolor paper. Remember, this is the paper that has, sometimes it has a bumpy edge and the surface feels rough. That's your watercolor paper. If you're right-handed, you want to put your paints to the right. If you're left-handed, they'll go on the other side. You'll also need some paper towel. The last time I went to the grocery store, there wasn't any. So if your family's concerned about using up your paper towel, just any old towel will work. This is just a rag I found at my house. And you need 2 cups for water. The Crayolas are non-toxic, so you can use just regular water cups at your house. That's fine too. The mixing area is small on these trays. If you need more room, you could just use a regular plate. That works fine for these, and they should rinse right off. Okay, let's talk about the paints. Watercolors are basically pigment without any binder or very much binder. Binder is what's kind of like a glue that holds the paint together. So what that means is when you wet the watercolor, it becomes very loose and you can re-wet it again and put it where you want. To work with the watercolors, you need to mix it with water. So I've got 2 cups here. One of these is going to be for clean mixing water. The other is to clean my brush out when it's dirty. So I'm going to start with my clean water one. And I'm just going to pick up the orange, and you'll notice that I'm dropping a bunch of water onto it. And then as I stir around, then the pigment loosens and goes into the water. And I can bring it out on the mixing tray to see how light it is. If it's too light, you can add more to make it darker. Okay, another thing that you should know about watercolors is that they are transparent. So as you're working, if you do a sketch and you have a pencil line and then you paint with watercolor, unlike the temperas, which would cover up that pencil, the watercolor, you're going to see the pencil line right through it. So you want to keep that in mind. You need to make sure that when you sketch your pencil work for your paintings, that you keep it really light and that you're very careful and erase anything that you don't want to show through. It will still be there if you leave it. Okay, as we're working with our paints, we want to work in a particular order. We want to work with our lightest values first and then move to the darkest. Now, if you look at your tray, you don't have white paint. The way you get white is by painting around it. So let's say that I'm painting an orange here. I want to pick a highlight or a spot that I'm going to leave white, and then what I would do is to just paint around where I want it to be white, and then just leave it as I work with the rest. So you have to think ahead. Anything that you want to be white in your painting, you don't want to paint it with anything, just leave it white. Okay, so that's the first thing to know about paints. Next up, since we're working light to dark, you need to, if you're working in areas that are next to each other, you want to do your dark colors last. So here I'm going to start with my lightest, I'm going to do a medium and then a dark. So I'll start with the light paint here. To get it lighter, I could add more water. So before I dip in my clean water, I want to rinse my brush out in the dirty water, pick up some clean water to add to it. You can see I'm just dropping it next to the color, and then I'm going to stir it in. So here I have a nice light orange. Now if you want to have an area that's next to it, so if I'm painting in this area that's next to the one I'm painting now, it's really easy to accidentally have the watercolors bleed over. So I want to let this one dry before I work on this one. What that means is I have to jump around with my painting and plan ahead. So I'm going to not paint this one until this one is dry. Instead, I'm going to work over here. I want to show you a couple of other things. Now, if I want the orange to be darker, I can stir in the paint more. and that's going to make a stronger orange. So this would be a darker orange, darker in value. And on your next assignment, I'm going to ask you to also change the saturation. So I'm just going to get a little bit too much paint in here because I want to show you how to clean it up if you've got too much. So let's say that you're painting along and you have too much paint in the area and you've got to mop this up. This is how you want to do it. You take your brush, clean it in your dirty water. Now squeeze it with your fingers. Now this is a damp brush and this is good for mopping, and I can just touch down on the edge and the paint is going to want to go in towards the brush. So that's a good way to mop up if you have too much paint. Now you don't want to go into it with a wet brush because you can't soak it up, and right now I've got too much on my brush now, so I need to repeat. If your brush is wet, it's not going to pull the water up and the paint up as easily. Okay, now I'm just going to take the rest and smooth it out a bit. There you go. Okay, so we're trying to paint smoothly, and that's how you can soak it up with the brush. All right, so on this one, I want to wait to paint this until the other two are dry. And so we're just going to let that dry for a minute. And I want to show you something else called a dry brush, damp brush, and wet brush. So if you're painting with a dry brush, what would that look like? I'm going to dry my brush off on the towel. I'm going to pick up just a little teeny bit of paint from the edge of the orange. And let's see, okay, here we go. So you can see that it has kind of a roughness to it, a rough texture. So if you're painting and you're getting this sort of rough texture happening, that means your brush is really dry. Now that can be useful if you're trying to get a texture, but we at this point want to get it nice and smooth. Okay, so to keep that from happening, you do want to load your brush with more paint and more water. So I'm going to take some clean water, stir it really well into the paints, and make sure I have a nice loaded brush. So this is a wet brush, and if I paint with this, you can see the difference between the two. So this is a dry brush and this is a wet brush. So you want to have it nice and wet while you're working with it. Okay, now if you're working with a really big area, and I think I'll do that, no, I'll just do it right here. If you're working with a really big area, another technique that you can try, and we'll do this later on, is to start by putting some water down first. Then you're going to let it sit on there for a few minutes. Then you want to blot it. You can blot it with a paper towel, with your brush, whatever you have handy. And then go in with your paint. And this gives you a really nice smooth wash, smoother than even just the wet brush. This is you only need to do this if you're working with a really big area. For most of the painting we'll be doing in this class, just making sure your brush is loaded will be just fine. All right, let's get back to our painting here over here. So we want to work light to dark. So this one is going to be our darkest one. You also want to make sure that you're painting next to dry areas. So this is dry. This is pretty dry at this point, so now I can go in with my third one. Also, I'm going to just quickly change the saturation, because we need to remember that to change the saturation, that's to make your color more dull. There are three ways to do it. One is to add the complement. In this case, the complementary color to orange is blue, so that's one way I could do it. Another way I could do it would be to add black or brown. I'm going to this time just desaturate it by adding a tiny bit of brown to it. So I have a desaturated orange. This is also making it darker. I want to keep my colors clean, so before I go back into the brown, I'm going to rinse it in my dirty water and then stir. Okay, so there I have a desaturated orange, and it's darker, so this will be my darkest color. I think I want to go a bit darker. I'm going to go darker. So before I stir more in the orange and the brown, I want to clean out my brush. So clean, stir, 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 get a lot of paint on there. Clean, stir. Okay, that should be darker. Let's try that one. There we go. Okay, Okay, now there's a reason that you want to do your darkest and your strongest colors last, and that has to do with bleeds. So I have right here a very dark, strong color. We have a red here. And if I were to take, let's say that I were painting near this, it would bleed right away. In fact, I can show you on this first. We have this nice wet color. If you're painting next to something that's wet, let's say I decide to go with a yellow and I'm painting this right next to it, and because that orange-brown is still wet, it's starting to bleed together right there. So that can cause some problems for you. So make sure that an area is dry before you paint next to it. But also, if you have a really strong dark color, if you go with another color next to it, even though it's dry, it can re-wet, and you can see how that red, I'll hold it up closer, you can see that the red is starting to bleed into that yellow. So they're mixing together again. Now, if that's something you want to do on purpose, then that's how you do it. But with some of your paintings, this could cause some problems for you. So you want to pay attention and remember that you always want to work from light to dark, and don't paint next to a strong color. You want to do those very, very last. All right, thank you very much and happy painting.